Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. The cost cap drama continues with Toto Wolff pointing the finger at other team principals, potentially Christian Horner from other big teams, for refusing to negotiate with Williams over a potential exception to the cost cap due to capital expenditure, with the intention, it seems, from the top teams to prevent anyone else catching up over time. Very much enjoyed to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. First of all, this is what we currently know for the 2024 driver lineup. Not much is probably going to happen this silly season, as it were. We've heard talks about Leclerc and Sainz going into 2025, but for next season, there might not be that much that happens. Perez has a contract for next season. I wouldn't say it's guaranteed by any means that he stays in that seat. With, let's say Daniel Ricciardo performs really well in the AlphaTauri, there's definitely a possibility there. Hamilton will surely return to Mercedes. Yes, it's taken a long time for them to get this contract done for some reason, but I'm sure they'll sign something. So probably a lot of the top teams are going to stay. Stroll, Alonso, Norris, Piastri, Leclerc, Sainz, Gasly, Ocon, this is all locked in by the contracts. Now, contracts, don't always mean that much, and things could change. Williams is an interesting one for sure. Albon will be there. There were rumours that Logan Sargent wasn't really... Basically, James Vowles, and we'll talk about him more in a second, wasn't massively impressed by Logan Sargent when they brought him in from Formula 2, but he's done an alright job. I mean, I don't think he's been spectacular, and I do think that Toto Wolff will try and get Mick Schumacher into that seat, to be honest, but they might give Sargent one more year. I wouldn't say that he doesn't deserve it. He's been solid enough, and the car isn't great, but he has been getting absolutely trounced by Albon. And the most dominant head-to-head of all the drivers on the grid is Albon versus Sargent. It's something like 22-1 over all the race and qualifying sessions that they've both finished, I suppose. Haas is unknown. They will re-sign Hülkenberg. That's almost for sure. Magnussen is a little bit of a question mark, because this is how Haas tend to treat their drivers in some respects. When Schumacher does well against Mazepin, oh yeah, Mick, he's our guy. When Magnussen does well against Schumacher, it's like, oh Mick, we don't like you anymore. Magnussen's our new best friends. And it might be the same story now, where they're not so sure whether they want to keep K-Mag around. Now Hülkenberg has been very impressive this season for sure, so that's a potential one. AlphaTauri, I think Tsunoda's going to stay, and I also think that Joe is probably going to stay at Alfa Romeo. So I'm not sure there's going to be many changes here. But I don't know if there's really ever been a Formula 1 season where there hasn't been at least one rookie coming into the year, and it's possible that it happens this time maybe. At AlphaTauri, we'll see about that, whether, Liam Lawson or somebody else gets a seat there. I think we will have a rookie somewhere here. Whether it's Haas, whether it's AlphaTauri, I don't know. And of course, that Daniel Ricciardo Perez question will be raised if he continues to do well in that machinery. Also, some further rumours that Mattia Binotto is very close to signing for Alpine. I'm not so convinced this would be a good idea for him personally, but apparently it's going to be happening now, and a lot of people are suggesting that it will happen. Not exactly sure when, because there was a gardening leave in place after Binotto left Ferrari, but that's definitely one to keep your eyes on. There was also an update from Helmut Marko. Now, as we know, Marko usually says it how it is, and there were rumours going around the other day that Perez, now he was 125 points down on Max Verstappen, there was a clause in his contract that enabled Red Bull to cut his contract, basically to cut his salary, and not cut his contract short, but reduce his salary and his bonuses and this type of stuff. Helmut Marko says, don't know where that came from, completely out of thin air. The contracts are strictly regulated, there will be no pay cuts. Pretty interesting. This comes from Eric Van Haren, right? Good journalist, very close to the Verstappen and the Red Bull camp. So I imagine it must have come from somewhere, but maybe Red Bull are just saying, you know what, even if we do have clauses, which apparently we don't, but even if we did, we're not doing anything about them. So Perez is presumably still making the same as he was previously. There have also been questions, will the FIA make some changes to try and slow down Red Bull? We discussed yesterday that they're looking to effectively disable DRS in qualifying, which seems like a clear intention to try and slow down Red Bull. It would make things maybe even more interesting in qualifying, because getting a tow from your teammate would probably be more valuable in that sense. So that's definitely one thing to look at as well. But some have suggested that going forwards, the FIA and Formula 1 will try and make changes to prevent Red Bull being the dominant team for the long term. And they've done this before when they've tried to stop Ferrari and then Mercedes and all these other teams. And, that's kind of how it goes in Formula 1. And for 2026, though, that's where there have been questions. Horner keeps saying that the engine regulations are like the Frankenstein monster, and it doesn't seem like Red Bull are maximally confident about those regulations, especially on the engine side. But it's unclear whether Formula 1 management and the FIA are going to change anything substantial until that time. Even Richard Bradley gave some comments on this and said that they've done done it plenty of times with Williams and then Ferrari and then other teams making changes to try and screw over the team that's leading, and he reckons that there will come a time in the cycle where Red Bull will lose out and another manufacturer will more than likely come to the fore, and then when that happens, then you might have to reevaluate the situation, because it does seem to be an eternal cycle. But no signs yet of them doing that, apart from this whole potentially disabling DRS in qualifying thing, which probably isn't going to make all that much difference. Now, speaking of Red Bull compared to their competitors, there has been a bit of drama, actually quite a lot of drama, I imagine, behind the scenes on exceptions to the cost cap. We talked about this from Vowles back in March, so of course former top strategy guy at Mercedes has joined Williams as their team principal over the last couple of months or so, and as Vowles said back in March, I personally think we need a meritocracy. The issue is, for Williams, especially because they haven't really had much funding compared to a lot of the other teams in that midfield scrap, as it were, nowadays, because Williams have made some steps this season. When you look at it from a resources perspective, and as that's what he says here, there are some systems that I would consider basics, which are in place in other teams and have been for like 15 years. For example, some software systems to track your parts, and at Williams, they just have like an email chain. Every part is not tracked by like a software system. They just have a load of email threads going back and forth that tell them where the parts are, which sounds like an absolute nightmare to me. But that's what they're doing, and somehow they still keep track of most of them, I imagine. But as he says, this is something that top teams have had for 15 years, but we just don't have the software to do that. When you've got 15,000 pieces coming together, it's an incredible accomplishment, but you know, we need more systems, we need more structures in place. And it's not just the software stuff, but it's also resources and equipment and stuff like that in their factory. Now, of course, the two of these guys, Toto Wolff, James Vowles, worked together for a long time, and there's been some rumours that maybe James Vowles will be lining up to become the next team principal of Mercedes once Toto Wolff decides to move on and maybe steps up into more of like a managing director type role, or whatever the case is. And while on one hand, the cost cap has benefited teams like Haas and teams like Williams, because Mercedes and Red Bull and Ferrari can no longer spend 3 times what they can, but it does also have a negative consequence in terms of resources that can be developed and capital expenditure, as it were. Gunther Steiner actually said just pretty much a couple of days ago that the money doesn't really matter that much. It's more about where that money goes. People think that if you invest 100 million, you can beat Mercedes. The money's a bit overrated. He talks about business model, but also from a capital expenditure perspective. And we saw this comment yesterday from Vowles, who says almost everyone at the back of the grid had their hands up to raise a cost cap exception, but the ones at the front didn't. And this almost indicated that Toto Wolff and Mercedes had said no, but actually Toto Wolff says that he said yes, and it was the other top teams that said no. The point here basically being that if you're a team like Williams, lacking the equipment and the resources that you need, then there maybe should be a rule that allows you to go over the cost cap just for those specific capital expenditure pieces, right? Because okay, you can spend 140 million a year just like Red Bull can, but if Red Bull and Mercedes have far more facilities and equipment and resources than you do, then it doesn't really matter how good your engineering team is. You're never going to be able to be as good. You're never going to be able to catch them unless you can, you know, use money to actually fund those resources. But the problem is that if you fund those resources, it takes it out of your cost cap. So you'd basically just have to drive around with the worst car by far for a couple of seasons so that you could actually use that money that would go to develop the car to developing your facilities, and it's not really a great system. So they think there should be an exception in place for teams to catch up, because, you know, fundamentally the point of this cost cap is trying to be, you would think, to level the playing field such that all the teams would have a better chance of producing a championship winning car. But that's far from the case. And Vowles actually admitted when he joined Williams that when he was at Mercedes, Mercedes knew this. Mercedes knew that this was going to help lock in the advantage for the big teams, and that was why a lot of the top teams were in favour of the cost cap in the first place. So now they're coming to the discussion, and Vowles is coming to the table and saying, hey, can we change this around a little bit? And apparently Toto Wolff said yes, we came up with a list. Some of the big teams said we don't want a list, and if Williams gets stuff, we want stuff. That was simply shut down. So he's denying that he was involved in shutting this down, because as I say, the comment from Vowles suggested that all the big teams said no and all the little teams said yes, but Toto Wolff saying no, I also said yes. Now, Now, you might expect this because Williams are a customer team of Mercedes. They have a good relationship. It's not quite a B team, but in some sense, it's not too far off in terms of drivers coming from Williams to Mercedes and stuff like that over the last several years. And they will probably be a Mercedes engine customer for a long time to come. But Toto Wolff is pretty much pointing the finger at the other big teams. So you're thinking Red Bull and Christian Horner in the meeting, and I guess you're thinking Ferrari, and then I guess Aston Martin as well, because they've got good facilities with all the investment they've made over the last couple of years before the cost cap came into effect. But Toto Wolff gives some thoughts on this and says, well, the capex discussion, capital expenditure discussion came up is that a team in Williams said their infrastructure is subpar. They wouldn't be able to catch up with trivial things like machine equipment and to technical things like simulators. That was the starting point. But all the other teams then said, all right, so if we can spend an extra 50 million on this, then why not 60? Why not 70? Why not 90? And it was like, all right, why don't we change the capex levels? But there's no reason to do that. I think there is one team that we need to treat differently than all the others. Now, of course, Toto Wolff might be inclined to say this, right? Because they have good relationships with Williams, so he would probably be inclined to suggest that Williams should be treated differently to others. But that is the general perception, that Williams have far worse infrastructure than many of the other teams, and therefore they should get some sort of capex exception to allow them to catch up. But why would the other teams agree to this? Why would they say, oh yeah, sure, one of my competitors can spend more money than I can? They're not going to say yes, are they? So this is one of the problems with the cost cap in the first place. And that's why, as Toto Wolff says, that yeah, the other teams, the big teams, just shot it down. And they said, well, if Williams gets stuff, we should get stuff as well. So he did conclude and say that there might be a way to find a solution just for Williams. But this is the thing, that if Williams gets to spend money, Haas is going to be like, well, you know, surely we can spend a bit more money. And then the cost cap becomes even more of a farce maybe than it already is. So intrigued to your perspective on that, but yeah, it is difficult to go more than a few days without finding some sort of Toto Wolff versus Christian Horner drama in there somewhere, and I imagine that there was discussions, maybe rather heated behind the scenes, that we haven't quite got a chance to see on this occasion. Just to quickly mention before we close out the video, this from Aston Martin. Rumour has it, and Singapore's a good few races away to be fair at this point, but rumour has it that they will be bringing a brand new front wing to Singapore. So even there was a rumour going around, this is from the Italian press, so always a little bit of a grain of salt here, but apparently in Baku, they intervened to, well, the FIA intervenes to allow or to force Aston Martin to change its front wing due to more flexibility than they wanted. And then the rumour was that after Baku, they were struggling a bit more, which is maybe true. I mean, they were great before Baku, but they're also pretty good immediately after Baku. It really was like Spain, Austria around that time where they started to fall back quite significantly. So they've got a new front wing coming in Singapore, and that might help them recover some lost pace. That's a circuit that their car at the start of the season would have been very good at, so we'll see if they can get back there at that point, but it is going to take something probably rather special to stop Red Bull and Max Verstappen in any races from now to the end of the season. But very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.